Welcome to this session of the CIL Climate Conversation Series. I am Ray Lapuno from the NUS Center for International Law. We are fortunate to have with us today Professor Daniel Bodansky, who will be discussing the who, the what, and wherefore of climate geoengineering governance, its legitimacy, and scenarios for analysis. If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to send them in the chat box, as there will be an opportunity to discuss them later on. Now let me invite Dr. Nilofer Ural, Director of the NUS Center for International Law, for the welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, dear Arela. And I'm truly delighted to have this opportunity to welcome Professor Dan Bodansky, who is, I consider, a great friend of CIL. He is our first NUS CIL visiting distinguished global scholar. We were really delighted to host him. So it's really a great pleasure to have you back with us to talk about a fascinating issue, a really important issue, geoengineering. And it goes without saying that Professor Bodansky is really one of the leading scholars and thinkers in climate change law. He has such a wealth of experience. So I know that his insight will definitely inform all of us. And I take this opportunity to welcome those of you joining us today, and those of you who will probably listen into the video afterwards. And also I thank the CIL team, Danielle and Rayla, for organizing the Climate Conversation Series, and of course, Jerry and Matthew for their support. So I'll stop here and so we can start right off with the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Ural. And now I have the honor of introducing our guest speaker for today, Professor Daniel Bodansky. Professor Bodansky is a foundation professor of law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law of Arizona State University. As Dr. Ural mentioned, last year we were very lucky that he joined CIL as a visiting distinguished global scholar. He is a preeminent authority in climate change and international environmental law, and is a prolific and celebrated author on the topic. He will be joined by Daniel Yao, Adjunct Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Climate Change Law and Policy Program at CIL.
And good evening to you, Professor Bodansky. Thank you very much for joining us at this time in this evening for you in the US. And it was a great pleasure to have you join us again. And a warm welcome to those joining us online from various parts of the world. The subject we are exploring today is a really fascinating subject, that of climate geoengineering. Faced with the growing threat of climate change, there's increasing interest and research in the potential of climate geoengineering to counter what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres described in Sharm el-Sheikh as the fight for our lives. So the term climate geoengineering refers to a broad set of methods and technologies that aim to deliberately alter the climate system in order to alleviate the impacts of climate change. Now, with what seems to be an inexorable increase in global emissions, the prospect and the potential, of course, of this technology to reverse global warming rapidly and, of course, cost-effectively is of great significance and interest to policy decision makers, to industry, to environmentalists. However, climate geoengineering also poses significant risk and concerns, can give rise to nightmare scenarios of unintended environmental consequences and technology going haywire, so to speak. And in this Working Group 3 report released in 2022, the IPCC has made clear that one particular type of geoengineering, that's carbon capture and storage, is a critical decarbonization strategy in most climate mitigation pathways. However, there does appear to be rather less enthusiasm and even doubts about other types of geoengineering, which have been portrayed as being, somewhat risky, somewhat ineffective. So perhaps to start us off, Professor Bodansky, could you explain, what is actually encompassed by this term climate geoengineering? A description that refers to these as deliberately altering the climate system, perhaps not unexpectedly, immediately does give rise to some concern and alarm as well.
Thank you, Danielle. And first of all, let me just say it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak tonight and to see again friends and colleagues from Center for International Law. So everything about geoengineering is controversial, and even the definition as to what qualifies as geoengineering is itself subject to a lot of disagreement. But I think, as you said, it generally refers to kinds of approaches that are large scale, that are intentional, that try to deliberately alter the climate system. Now, I guess I would say we're already geoengineering the climate because we're putting up billions, gigatons of carbon dioxide every year into the atmosphere. We have increased the concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by more than 50% from pre-industrial levels. So we already are having a tremendous effect on the climate system. We know that we're having that effect. We're continuing to emit. So I guess I would say that in some ways we already have geoengineered the climate. That's why people now refer to the current age we're in as the Anthropocene, because we humans are having a huge effect on the entire globe. But in terms of the way geoengineering is usually referred to, it is things that are usually technologically oriented, that are intentional, that are large scale. And really, I think, though, it makes more sense, instead of speaking about the broad category where there's going to be a lot of disagreements as to what it's in and what's out, it makes more sense to speak about more specific technologies. And as you said, there are two general categories. One is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and through a variety of techniques. And the other is trying to reflect more sunlight away from the earth to cool it off. And these are very different kinds of approaches. Both would have an effect on the climate system. But one, carbon dioxide removal is something we already do. It occurs through natural processes, growing trees, reforestation. That's one of the main methods currently of carbon dioxide removal. That's, I think, raises quite different issues in many respects than trying to reflect more sunlight away from the earth, or what's sometimes referred to as solar radiation management, SRM. So I think in my writing, I try to speak more about specific approaches rather than the general category, because I think the general category tends to confuse more than it does to enlighten, because the approaches are quite different and raise different kinds of issues.
Oh, thanks very much. And there's a helpful clarification of the two categories. I think one, the carbon capture storage is a little bit more mature, perhaps more promising. What is a little bit probably lesser known and causes greater concern is perhaps what you mentioned, SRM. I'm just wondering, have these actually been deployed in any ongoing projects in anywhere in the globe? And has this caused any operational or real issues on the ground?
In terms of solar radiation management?
Yes, solar radiation.
So the issue right now with solar radiation management really is more whether to do research on it rather than to deploy, because there's no proposals currently to deploy solar radiation management. There are a number of different ways one could try to reflect sunlight away from the earth, and the two main ones are to put various aerosols into the stratosphere, and aerosols tend to reflect sunlight, and so that would reduce the amount of solar radiation that's coming in and reaching the surface of the earth and warming it up. The other technique is sometimes referred to as marine cloud brightening. This is to disperse small particles in the lower atmosphere, in the troposphere above the sea. And these particles would form cloud condensation nuclei, and would, the theory is, increase the brightness of the clouds over the oceans. And that would, the bright clouds also reflect sunlight away. So these are two quite different approaches to reflecting sunlight. Neither one there's any discussion of deploying. The real issue is whether or not to do, at the moment, whether or not to do research on it. I think the reason nobody's talking about deployment is there hasn't been enough study as to exactly how one would do it, what the different techniques would entail. For example, how do you inject things into the lower atmosphere that would they in fact brighten the clouds or not? What would be the ideal diameter of them and so forth and so on. And then there's also not studies or not confidence that we know enough about what the effects would be, and particularly this potential side effects. So I think speaking about deployment at this stage would be irresponsible, because until we know whether it's feasible, effective, and safe, it's impossible to evaluate whether or not it would make sense or not. The question is right now whether to even do research on it or not. So that's sort of where we are today. With respect to carbon dioxide removal, it's a little different. I think virtually everyone accepts, well, at least the IPCC has said that carbon dioxide removal will be essential to stabilizing the global climate at 1.5 degrees, that there are no emission scenarios that they're looking at that would actually reduce emissions quickly enough to keep the temperature within the 1.5 degree limit that countries now under the Paris Agreement have agreed as basically the goal of international climate policy. So carbon dioxide removal, I think now there's increasing acceptance that it's going to be necessary. And so the question is, what are the different techniques? How effective would they be? How do we do the measurement of them to make sure they're actually removing carbon? How do we give crediting for that? So there are a lot of issues related to carbon dioxide removal, but that's really, I think, more in the short term, what people are thinking are thinking could be done. And I think there's more acceptance that it's necessary for it to be done. Whether we do solar radiation management, much bigger question as to whether we do it at all. Whereas carbon dioxide removal, I think we're going to need to do it, just a question of how and how to regulate it and so forth.
I mean, I think the IPCC did talk about something requiring something, the carbon dioxide removal, something at the rate of 6 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. The question really is, I suppose, to what extent, how far are we, at least in deployment of these type of carbon capture storage technologies? At what rate of the deployment are we now, and how far are we from actually reaching the Paris Agreement goals? And what is actually needed to push this process along?
Yeah. Well, I think we're pretty far away from having the ability to deploy carbon dioxide removal at scale, at the scale necessary to fit into the IPCC scenarios. With carbon dioxide removal, there are also a wide variety of techniques, some of which are better understood, some of which are less well understood, some of which are understood but are quite expensive currently, and the question is whether the cost can be brought down. So I guess I would distinguish between there's land-based carbon dioxide removal and there's ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. Land-based carbon dioxide removal itself has a number of different approaches. Growing more biomass is one approach. That's something we know how to do. It's a question of whether we can do it at a large enough scale quickly. Another is to increase the amount of carbon taken up by rocks as they weather. And so that's something that's less well understood, but has large potential capacity. And then the third is to directly take carbon out of the atmosphere through technology, through what are sometimes referred to as mechanical trees. So as the air passes, you build these structures, and as the air passes through, the carbon dioxide would be taken out through chemical processes and then sequestered. The last, people are already developing those technologies. They're still quite expensive per ton. Some countries are actually going to be going ahead on a sort of trial basis. I think Switzerland is considering it. Iceland is considering it. There's a number of commercial companies that are developing these technologies. And then the idea would be remove the carbon dioxide and then pressurize it, liquefy it, and then pump it underground for long-term storage. So there's a variety of techniques. None of them, I think, at the moment are able to be deployed at scale, the kind of scale necessary. Some of which are really still at an early stage of development, like rock weathering, as to how that would work and how one would scale that up. So, and then that's all land-based. And then let me just say, there's also ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. So this would be to try to increase the amount of carbon dioxide taken out of the atmosphere by the oceans, for example, by trying to grow more plankton as plankton grows through photosynthesis, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. And then the hope is that when the plankton dies, it sinks to the bottom of the ocean and then is sequestered there for a very long period of time. There's, I think, increasing interest now in ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. It has the potential to be scaled up very rapidly, but because you're doing it in the open ocean, then one wants to be very careful about the effects it might have on the marine ecosystem. So again, with these, you need to be thinking about where it's going to take place. Is it on land or at sea? How much is it contained or not? So carbon dioxide removal through mechanical trees is quite contained. It doesn't have the potential to really go awry. Whereas if you do ocean-based carbon dioxide removal in the open ocean, then it could have some very large-scale effects on ocean ecosystems. So there's a variety of factors. I think with each of these, one needs to sort of work through to try to assess what kinds of issues they raise.
Thanks. So if I may just drill into it a little bit more, because it does seem from what I'm hearing that it's a fairly technology-specific considerations required. The technical considerations are there, the operational considerations are there. Some are more developed, some are more mature. The others, there's associated uncertainty. But I wonder if there's a common theme among all these different technologies. And that really leads me to the question I wanted to get to today, which is really the governance point. Amidst the variety of techniques, how are we going to find an overarching framework? Should we even be looking at overarching legal framework or governance framework? Or should we be looking at technology-specific framework or even regional-specific framework? And what is this underlying common concern vis-a-vis governance and the kind of environmental issues we're concerned about? Transboundary pollution, uncertain impacts. You mentioned impacts on ocean acidification, biodiversity. So I was just, from this perspective, what should we be looking at in terms of the governance? That's really where I'm coming. What are the rules? Are there applicable rules one can look at? What are the elements one should be?
Well, let me take the two different approaches to geoengineering in turn. So let me start with carbon dioxide removal. So I think a general governance question for all forms of carbon dioxide removal is measuring and verifying that the carbon dioxide removal has taken place. So no matter how you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, whether it's through mechanical trees, by rock weathering, by growing more trees, by trying to do ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, no matter how you're doing it, there needs to be the ability to measure and verify how much carbon has been taken out of the atmosphere. That runs across all of these different approaches. Beyond that, though, I think the different approaches have different governance issues. I don't think, for example, and by the way, a related issue to the measurement and verification is the permanence issue, that if you're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, it needs to be permanently removed from the atmosphere. If it has the ability to seep back into the atmosphere, for example, if there's forest fires that burn all the trees you've grown, then you haven't really done anything to the climate system because the carbon you've taken out by growing the trees now has been put back into the atmosphere when the trees burn down. So there's a permanence issue that runs across all of these different kinds of carbon dioxide removal techniques. But then the ones that are land-based, like mechanical trees, I don't think really raise particularly governance issues. It's done within a country's territory. It has essentially just reverses the effects of a country putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now they're just taking it out of the atmosphere and liquefying it. I don't think that raises particular issues of international governance. Ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, in contrast, does raise international issues because now you're doing it outside of national territory. The potential effects are affecting not just the country that's doing it, but other countries around the world. So I think those two different kinds of techniques, one raises international issues, the other one really doesn't, apart from the measurement, verification, and permanence issues. With respect to solar radiation management would affect the global climate system, so it affects every country in the world. So it does raise questions about who decides what kinds of, what institution, what would be a decision-making process, should it be left up to national governments or not? So there are quite a few issues that arise with respect to solar radiation management, because it does have this potentially global impact. Well, it will have global impacts on the climate system, but then it might also have transboundary impacts on particular countries. For example, has been concern that solar radiation management could change the Indian monsoon. And if the Indian monsoon changes, that could affect food production in the Indian subcontinent. So, so there are some significant issues there. In my view, though, it's a little premature to be trying to figure out the governance questions at this point, because, or at least in any detail, because we really don't know enough yet about solar radiation management to really know exactly what kinds of potential risks it poses, how big those risks are, who might be impacted by the risks, who then should have be able to contribute in some fashion to decision making. So I think there are a lot of issues at the research level that need to be figured out first before we can really talk very seriously about the governance questions. Right now, I mean, there is governance in the sense that there already are principles of international environmental law that apply to all human activities, including geoengineering. There's the duty to use due diligence to prevent significant transboundary harm, to do environmental impact assessments of activities that might have a significant transboundary impact, to notify and consult with potentially affected states. So if a country were going to be engaging in some kind of solar radiation management activity, it would be need to use due diligence to try to prevent significant harm, to do environmental impact assessments, to notify and consult if there are other states that are going to be affected. So there are a number of general principles that apply to all human activities and would also apply to climate engineering. I think beyond those, really, to my mind right now, the biggest governance gaps are at the national level rather than the international level. Right now, it's unclear whether countries really are regulating what's going on by their citizens, by their private companies, whether or not if somebody tried to do something outside the US, whether US law applies, how it would apply, what the standards would be. So I think I've written about this before. I think an initial first step is to develop some kind of national model research program that does have good governance built into it, that requires assessments, that requires transparency, that requires involvement by scientists from different countries around the world, to try to model how one should try to be studying this question. And that hopefully will set precedents for other countries to also behave responsibly in investigating geoengineering.
Thanks, Daniel. So we're looking at perhaps a few stages for technologies which are perhaps more speculative, less mature. We mentioned the SRM, where the focus really ought to be on research. And the question is really, in conducting such research, there seems to be a gap, even at a national level. Recently, I believe Norway, or Sweden rather, I think in 2021, and I think you mentioned this in one of your articles as well, they actually postponed certain stratospheric controlled experiments because of pressure from activist groups. In January of this year, the Mexican government also announced a ban on solar engineering deployments and experiments on its territory, really in response to really a private US-based company's so-called unauthorized solar geoengineering flights in Mexico. So that seems to be the first category where we don't even have a set of rules that can, govern the safe conduct of research in this area, and that would be one category. The second category would really be on technologies that you mentioned, which are more mature. We actually deployed, things like carbon capture storage. Although there are a variety of such technologies, those operations are going on. We have the Northern Lights project as well, for example, where you mentioned a couple of governance issues. And I wonder whether or not we can take, and you can give examples of specific, if you mentioned examples of certain principles, and can we classify them, into, principles of international law, applicable customary international law, even treaty-based principles, or even decisions from, international agreements and treaties are in place. The CBD has had a sort of a moratorium, loosely called a moratorium on geoengineering that can impact on biodiversity. Do you see this, expanding in scope as we go along, as these technologies become more advanced? Which are the critical questions you feel that the international community should be looking at if we are ever going to be looking at giving guidance to national governments or to international organizations, the UN, as they're debating these? What are the key issues and topics in terms of the actors, in terms of the standards that actually should be the purpose of such governance?
Well, I think I think it's going to take place mostly at the national level. I guess I'm skeptical as to how much the international community is going to be able to provide guidance beyond what's already there in international environmental law, with things like the duty to use due diligence, the duty to assess, the duty to notify and consult on these general principles. I think in my mind, as I said, I think it's premature to do that much more than those kind of principles at this point, because we really don't know enough about geoengineering. I think to my mind, the concern is that the international community, that opponents of geoengineering will succeed in shutting down research. I think at the moment, there's very little research taking place, or there's not nearly enough research taking place. And it's very difficult to do research. You mentioned the Mexican government's new law, the inability to conduct the experiment in Sweden that a geoengineering group wanted to do, that involved just dispersing a little bit of water vapor, much less exhaust than commercial flights are putting out, thousands of times a day in the upper atmosphere. Just a teeny amount of water vapor, just to understand better how it disperses, and the microphysics as to how it interacts in the stratosphere. Even an experiment that would have no physical effects whatsoever, that was shut down in Sweden. So I think it's it's difficult to do experiments at the moment, and we don't really, we're not going to be able to answer questions about how feasible, how effective, how safe it's going to be. And then I think there's a big danger that if we're not successful in reducing emissions sufficiently, removing carbon from the atmosphere, and the temperature really continues to increase, there's then going to be the potential, at least, for some countries to think as a last resort, well, let's try geoengineering without even knowing if it's going to work, how to do it most effectively, how to do it most safely. So I think there's a big, people are concerned about the dangers of doing research. I guess to my mind, the dangers of not doing research are much greater, because I think in this case, ignorance is not a good thing. I think ignorance leads to ill-advised decisions that aren't well informed about the potential benefits and risks of an activity. So I guess I think I would take a lighter touch right now in terms of international regulation, because we're really still these are for the emerging technologies, the things like solar radiation management, where we really are just at the beginning. We know that aerosols reflect sunlight because we can see the effect of volcanoes, which spew aerosols into the atmosphere, into the stratosphere. They have a measurable effect on the climate system. So we have proof of concept, but exactly how we would do it and how we would do it could do it most safely and most effectively, that's, there's still a lot to be learned about that. So I think there's a danger of over-regulation. So I guess I would want to have these more general principles that should inform governments that should try to develop, some governments should try to take the lead by developing model approaches, research programs to model good behavior. And to my mind, that's a better approach right now on the research on these technologies that are much, just at the very beginning stages of being studied. With respect to the carbon dioxide removal techniques, some of which could be deployed right now, in fact, some of which are going to be deployed right now, like direct air capture, at a small scale. It's quite expensive, but the idea is if you start somewhere, then eventually as it scales up, the cost will come down. That's at least the hope. Reforestation, growing crops, things like that. Those raise governance issues right now. And I think the focus internationally should really be developing some better rules to deal with those. Just for one example, the IPCC methodologies for inventories of your greenhouse gas emissions and removals don't address some potential carbon dioxide removal techniques. So if a country was going to go ahead and try to remove carbon through rock weathering, for example, there'd be no standardized methodologies, inventory methodologies for how you would account for that. So, so I think the more urgent governance needs in terms of developing rules and standards are for some of these technologies that might be able to, that are going to be needed, according to the IPCC, to remove carbon from the atmosphere, that countries are already interested in deploying, some of which already are deployable, trying to develop the way we regulate those under our existing international system of the Paris Agreement.
Oh, thank you. Is there enough conversation on those priority issues that you've highlighted for the more developed technologies? Is there enough of a linkage between the policy and the scientists and the accountants even on this issue of the linkage? Yeah.
So in Sharm el-Sheikh, the committee that's developing some of the rules for how emissions trading is going to work under the Paris Agreement put out something on carbon dioxide removals and how they would be addressed in terms of the market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement, but those were quite heavily criticized and they were withdrawn and they're going to go back to the drawing board. So there's the beginnings of some discussions about, for example, if one country removes carbon from the atmosphere, could they trade those removals with other countries, or if they're funding removals of carbon dioxide in another country, how does the crediting work for that? If Switzerland, for example, were to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then ship the carbon to Norway, how would that be accounted for? So there are a lot of these questions about accounting for carbon dioxide removals and measuring carbon dioxide removals that I think the discussions are really just beginning. And so I think that's something that's, in terms of what's most urgently needed, I think that's something, it's more tractable. We know we're going to need those rules. They don't raise particularly different issues, so they, I think, can be addressed at the current stage. I think developing rules for some of these more futurist technologies like solar radiation management, I think the danger is you'll develop rules that really don't make sense for the technologies because we don't really yet know enough about the technologies.
So it's salutary warning between premature and overregulation that could end up crimping and chilling the technology. I think that the concern here seems to be that there seems to be a sort of I won't call it conflict, but a tension between the research that needs to go ahead to find out to find out whether this is even a safe or effective technology, vis-a-vis the I suppose the legitimately held concern and fear as to how tinkering with nature or the climate, what kind of unknown consequences can occur. And I wonder, vis-a-vis the more futuristic sort of technologies, what can international lawyers or domestic lawyers and policymakers and scientists do to counter or to address some of these concerns which have been raised by activist groups, indigenous groups, for example? Is there a role for education? Is there a role for facilitation? what is the role of multinational institution banks, for instance, in this debate vis-a-vis futuristic technologies?
So that's a really excellent question. And the question is really, how can you build more of a common interest? I think there should be a common interest in doing research on these techniques, because I mean, I hope that the Paris Agreement will do enough, but I guess I wouldn't want to bank on the Paris Agreement being fully successful in preventing dangerous climate change. And really, if it's not, solar radiation management is one of the very few, or maybe the only technique that could intervene rapidly to reduce the temperature to prevent, disastrous effects of global warming. So, so I think there should be a common interest in understanding whether it really is something that could be used or not, but there's not currently. And so it's a question of how do you build trust? How do you build some confidence internationally? Because the fear is right now that it's going to be developed in secret. It's going to be deployed by some countries to their own advantage, disadvantaging other countries, that it won't be used equitably. So there's a lot of, I think, fears that in my view are, at this point unfounded, but nevertheless they are real and inhibit the ability to engage in research. So I think trying to develop international research programs that are collaborative, trying to involve scientists from many different countries around the world, so that the scientific research on climate engineering is not just being done in a few Western industrialized countries, trying to just do more outreach so that there's to try to address some of the concerns that some groups and countries, people in some countries have. I think there are very few people who are really very aware of climate engineering at the moment, solar radiation management. I think the average person is probably doesn't know much about it at all, or isn't even aware of its possibility. So it tends to be a few, a relatively small set of actors who are quite concerned about it, and then have quite a large impact. So I think trying to do more general outreach, trying to, and I think involving scientists from many, many countries is going to be essential to try to develop more trust in the process.
And also some success stories would be helpful, I think, in moving the conversation along.
Yes.
I think in December last year, actually, there was the first reported successful field test in ocean geoengineering in Florida, where they reportedly used some alkaline lime powder, and it was shown to have brought down the carbon as well as reduced acidification. Of course, it's not at scale. The question is whether it can be deployed at scale, but success stories like that can help to push the conversation. So
sure. Yeah, and right now in Australia, there's some research being done to try to do marine cloud brightening to protect the Great Barrier Reef. So that would be localized solar radiation management, where the cloud cover would be, over the Great Barrier Reef to try to cool off the ocean around the reef to try to prevent coral bleaching. So I think there's some interesting activities that might raise fewer alarm bells. And if they're successful, that might then contribute to greater willingness to at least investigate solar radiation management. I think the way it's framed, in my view, is one-sided, because people say, well, solar radiation management, we're tampering with the Earth's climate. It could be used inequitably. It could be used to the advantage of some countries over other countries. And these are all legitimate concerns, totally legitimate concerns. But I think the fact of the matter is, right now, we're already having huge impacts on the climate system, on the Earth system, through our emissions. The emissions lead to huge global inequities in that the countries that are most affected by climate change are poor developing countries that have relatively little capacity or lesser capacity to adapt to climate change, but who've contributed themselves very little to the problem. So we're dealing with the baseline. The baseline is not a perfect world where we're not affecting the planet, where things are being addressed in an equitable fashion. We're already in a world where we're having huge negative impacts on the Earth's climate system that are leading to huge global inequities. So I think the comparison is not geoengineering versus a perfect world. The comparison is geoengineering compared to the world we have. And so the question is, does geoengineering have at least the potential to improve matters or not? And I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question because we don't really know enough yet about the science of climate engineering, what kind of risks it raises and so forth, how effective it is. But I think given that we're already in a very bad situation, it's worth investigating. One of the very few technologies that at least has the potential to improve matters by reducing the how much the planet warms. One thing I just might add is we already actually are doing solar radiation management, although people don't think of it that way, because pollution leads to huge amounts of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere already. And those aerosols already are cooling the planet. In fact, I think people think that the Earth hasn't warmed as much as some of the models originally predicted, because the pollution we currently are emitting is having a cooling effect, counterbalances some of the warming from carbon dioxide. Now, as we deal with localized air pollution and as we reduce sulfur dioxide emissions, as we should, to try to deal with address the local environmental impacts it has and health impacts it has, that masking effect that it's having on global warming will disappear. And so one of the proposals is simply to replace the sulfur dioxide that we're putting into the lower atmosphere right now through pollution with injecting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it's not going to have those localized health impacts, just to try to keep things even, so that as we clean up localized pollution, we're not then contributing more, leading to more global warming. So, that's just one example where comparing solar radiation management against doing nothing, that would be one, then you might think it's worrisome to do solar radiation management, sulfur dioxide injection into the stratosphere. But if you think we're already injecting sulfur dioxide into the troposphere, into the lower atmosphere, having huge environmental impacts, then just replacing that current pollution with putting sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere doesn't maybe that's an easy win, an easy benefit. So I think it's always compared to what. I think whenever we're thinking about these questions, it's always compared to what. And so I think in this case, the what we're comparing things to is what that's leading to a lot of problems, namely large-scale emissions, global warming, the inequities it causes.
I think it's quite right. I think what you said is important for us to realize. It's about framing the conversation. How do you frame the narrative? Because on its own, taken in its vacuum, I must admit, I'm one of those really unschooled in this solar radiation. And taken in vacuum on its own without any context is certainly on the face of it, is quite an alarming idea. And so framing the narrative, and as you say, the point about relativity of what we're doing now is a helpful sort of conversation to start off. And that's really where, even if we don't use the word governance, it's really a question of what can be done now. The focus on education, the focus on collaboration, the focus, and I think you wrote an article in 2021 about in arguing that research, for example, on solar climate intervention, in your view, is the best defense against what we call moral hazard, the need to conduct research in the first place. And then there will be a set of priorities, as you mentioned. What are the research parameters? What can be done, as opposed to technologies where there is actually a real potential already of current current deployment, then the focus then shifts to, well, what are the rules that need to be in place to govern the standards, the safety, the liability, the players, the actors, which include a number of non-state actors as well. And coming to the question of non-state actor, we came across this reference to the Oxford Rules or the Oxford Principles. It's put together by Oxford Principles for Geoengineering Governance. Do you see potential for these principles in some sort of a guiding, not voluntary sort of norm that could work?
So the Oxford Principles were developed some time ago by a group of academics in Oxford. And so I think there have been more recent efforts to develop a code of conduct for geoengineering. I think the Oxford Principles were a pretty early attempt to develop some principles. I've been somewhat critical and have written about the Oxford Principles myself a bit, because I don't think they necessarily capture the way one should think about geoengineering. But I think there is a potential role to be thinking through at a general level, what kinds of principles should be applicable. And I think there are principles like assessment, consultation, transparency, collaboration. So I think there are some principles that researchers, government should be thinking about if they're going to be going ahead and doing research on solar climate engineering.
I guess related to that would be kind of factors that would actually promote compliance by these actors, self-compliance, so to speak, voluntary compliance. This doesn't seem to be an age issue where there are any existing mechanisms, or whether, as you said, it's ready enough for even a more rigid set of rules. Before I close off the questions, I'd like to just invite the participants on this program to please put in your questions in the Q&A section. And I think there's already one in place, and I would like to leave some time to address that question. But before I turn to those questions that may be there, I just wanted to check, or maybe I'll just turn to the question now and then fold it up to my question on, in your view, what are the legal and policy obstacles to adopting geoengineering? And I think we kind of touched on it, but what do you think are the biggest issues and the biggest obstacles right now? Whether you call it research or whether you call it adoption and deployment.
Do you want me to address that now, or?
Yes, if you could, and then I will just raise also a question that's specific to the question of solar radiation management. And the question is whether there's any international organization that could provide a potential forum to facilitate research or discussion, or even to develop regulations such as an EIA. So two different questions. Yeah.
Well, let me just address that second question first, and then come back to your question. So I wrote a paper a couple of years ago now with Sue Biniaz, trying to survey the different institutions that could potentially address climate interventions. And we distinguish between institutions that could do an assessment function and institutions that could do a decision-making function. And I think really there's three levels. There's really doing the research, then there's the assessment, and then there's the decision-making. And it probably wouldn't need to be the same institution doing those. So in terms of the research, in terms of collaborative research, I think there already are existing international climate research programs in trying to integrate the research on climate interventions into those would make sense. So there's the World Climate Research Program, for example. WMO helps coordinate that. So I think there's one function as to who should take the lead in internationally coordinating research efforts, because I think that's important to try to, both for the purpose of efficiency of dividing up what the research questions are and having them make sure they're being addressed, but also in order to build more international trust through having more international collaborations. So then the second function is assessment. And there, I think, I mean, there's one obvious answer is to have the IPCC do assessments. I think there hasn't been a very comprehensive assessment of what we know and what we don't know about geoengineering and both the feasibility, the effectiveness, and the risks it poses. IPCC takes a long time to do assessments. It's quite a cumbersome process. They would need to approve a special report, which would take time. So I think, in my view, given the urgency, IPCC might be too slow. Montreal Protocol has a scientific assessment process, and they actually put out in their most recent assessment, I think it's just being published this month, a chapter on solar radiation management, focusing primarily on the effects of solar radiation management on the stratospheric ozone layer, but also looking at it to some degree more broadly. So I think the Montreal Protocol might be able to play a role here, and it's been a very effective scientific assessment process. The third is the decision-making process and who can make decisions, and that's obviously the most difficult. Whether there's going to be any institution that really can play a decision-making role, I think, is a question. The only really existing institution with that kind of decision-making role right now is the Security Council. Security Council, could play a role in either if a country is going ahead with geoengineering in terms of trying to stop it, or in terms of authorizing the use of geoengineering, as the Security Council currently authorizes, in some cases, the use of force. So the Security Council could play a role either in trying to stop geoengineering that the international community doesn't want to take place, or in authorizing it. The problem with the Security Council, of course, is that the permanent 5 members have to all be in agreement. So a scenario where the Security Council could play a role would require the 5 permanent members being all aligned in terms of what they'd like to do or not do or stop from doing. In terms of other institutions, there's really not another institution that has currently that kind of decision-making authority. And I think I'm skeptical as to whether or not there's going to be an ability internationally to agree to something. I think the problem is countries that want to go ahead with or want to keep the option open aren't going to join an institution that could potentially veto what they think they might need to do in their national interest. So I guess I'm skeptical as to whether that's feasible. I think it's premature to really be thinking about that yet, decision-making, because we really first need to do the research. If it turns out that geoengineering is not very effective, raises huge risks, then we won't need decision-making about it because we shouldn't be doing it in the first place. It's only where geoengineering seems like a could potentially contribute to addressing the climate problem, would we really need to have some institution that can make decisions about it. So I think it's a little premature to think about decision making. I think really the research and the assessment is where we should be putting our focus right now, and then we can think about the decision making later on. Having institutions, though, as I said, that can be doing monitoring, accounting, so we understand better how to account for carbon dioxide removals. I think, in my view, we should be focusing on the things that we need to address now, either on the research for solar radiation management, or in terms of things like accounting and measurement in the case of carbon dioxide removal. We should focus on those now, defer the other issues, which are going to be incredibly difficult to address, and we don't really know whether we will need to address them, how we should address them at this point, because we really don't know yet enough about the technologies themselves.
Thanks, Professor Banjan. So that's the focus on what I call the critical elements to make this operational. When it can be understood, when there's common language, at least, where very relevant to building that foundation of trust that you mentioned, and a common language that when one looks at it, one understands accounting, one understands the verification. So that's a very helpful way of putting it, and I thank you very much for making that so clear.
Just to come back to your question,
yes.
In terms of the role of international law, I think a lot of times people think about the role of international law as something that limits action. So what can international law do to limit solar geoengineering? I guess I don't think that's really the right question, because I don't know yet whether we would want to limit it, how we would want to limit it, what kinds of restrictions we want to put in it. The role, though, of international law is not confined to prohibiting action or limiting action. It can also facilitate action. So I think another way of thinking about the role of international law is the role it can play in trying to develop research programs, provide collaboration, provide for transparency, provide for funding, so that we can actually begin to do the research we need to do to understand the safety and effectiveness of geoengineering. So I think of really the role of international law more in terms of its facilitative role more than its regulating role, because I think it's a little premature, to my mind, with respect to the solar radiation management, to be thinking about how to regulate it.
Yes, thanks very much. I think it's a very important reminder of what the governance is actually. That was one of the questions that I posed earlier. What really is the purpose of governance?
Yes.
By whatever name you call it. Is it necessary? Is it to regulate? Is it to facilitate? Is it to promote? In fact, it can be all this and all these elements. It's only a question of what is the priority element at this point in time where we are. And that kind of helpfully brings us to the end of a conversation, but also the last question which I wanted to pose, which I think you've kind of answered, because when we look ahead to COP28, for instance, and I'm trying to think ahead of this conversation, and this conversation having a very important role, this conversation about carbon capture technologies, also climate engineering technologies, and really what is your wish list for the conversation to take place this year coming up? In relation to the subject, what would be your wish list?
So I would hope my wish list would be really focused on the carbon dioxide removal, because I think that's really something that countries are going to be doing, that needs to should be fitted into the Paris Agreement regulatory structure. So I would hope that there's attention given to what kinds of reporting there should be, what kinds of accounting rules should there be, how should carbon dioxide removal be addressed under the Article 6 market mechanisms, because those, I think, are things that are going to be coming along quickly, and countries need to start really be thinking about how they should be addressed. So I would hope that at COP28, there's more discussion of the carbon dioxide removal, the implications of carbon dioxide removal for the Paris Agreement, and how the Paris Agreement structure should address carbon dioxide removals in much more detail than it does right now.
Thanks very much, Professor Bodansky. I promise you we'll stop on the hour, and we will stop at the hour. If there are no other questions, it remains for me to thank you once again for being so generous in sharing your knowledge and really very masterfully bringing us through all the issues that one ought to be thinking of and how one should be approaching these questions. Before I turn it over to you to close, I see your camera is on at the moment.
Oh, thank you. I didn't expect to do the closing, but thank you so much, Professor Bodansky, Dan, for a truly insightful and enlightening discussion about a very important topic, because we really need to find solutions, but the solutions have to have the proper legal framework and governance framework. And I think you've really given us an excellent, shall I say, an excellent lecture really outlining this. So look forward to seeing you back at CIL again to continue this conversation.
Well, thanks very much. Very much enjoyed this. Thank you all.